This is your story. This is my story. But most of all, this is the greatest story ever told. This is God's story. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone there to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard this, he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon. He returned from Egypt. So they sent for Jeroboam, and he and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, "Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime. "How would you advise me to answer these people?" he asked. They replied, "If today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants." But Rehoboam rejected the advice the elders gave him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him. He asked them, "What is your advice? How should we answer these people who say to me, 'Lighten the yoke your father put on us'?" The young men who had grown up with him replied, "These people have said to you, 'Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter.' Now tell them, 'My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." When all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, "What share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David."
Well, good morning, everyone. So I was thinking of a story. It's actually one of my earliest memories. And I know it's a memory because there's no picture of this. My parents haven't told me this story, but I remember this very clearly. It was before we moved to Georgia when I was a kid, which I moved here when I was 5. So I had to have been like 4, maybe 3. And we were outside of our house in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. And being a 4-year-old, I had some kind of an action figure. It might have been a wrestler or it might have been like a G.I. Joe. I don't really remember. But I was throwing it in the air, as kids do. I don't know how many toys make and broke throwing them in the air and watching them fall to the ground and trying to catch them and that kind of stuff. And I'm throwing this figure in the air, and he lands in a bush in front of the house. My dad is there, and he's watching, and he's talking to the neighbor. And they're just having a conversation, and of course I point out to him that my toy is stuck in that bush. Would he please do something about it? And I'm sure I was exactly that polite when I asked. And he kind of told me to wait. He was in a conversation. He'd get it later. And I go over there, and I'm starting to root around in the bush and try and find it. He says, "No, don't do that. I told you to wait for me." And so then he turns and he talks to the neighbor, and of course I'm 4, and I don't understand why I can't get this myself. And so I continue reaching around in the bushes, trying to get that toy, and then all of a sudden this wasp comes out, lands on my finger, and I get my first sting. Anyone have a similar story to that, where you didn't obey what your dad told you, and then in the end something happened to you, right? This is very human. It's very natural. It's sort of the way that things go. And for me, it actually formed one of my earliest memories. And one of the things that I realized is that sometimes, maybe, perhaps, young people don't always tend to believe that the adults are smarter than them and have good reasons for their suggestions and rules. Did you ever feel like that as a kid? I remember this all the time when my son now, when I tell him something and he just argues with me up and down because something seems obvious to him, and I tell them that's not the case. It is just the same story over and over again. One generation learns out of their struggles in life, tries to pass it down to the next generation, and what do? They ignore it, reach their hand out, and get stung, right? It's the way life works. It's just one generation after another. It's a tale as old as time. And today's story is interesting because it is, in essence, largely this kind of idea. Remember last week under Solomon, we said it was really the height of Israel's history. It was really their best point in which Solomon asks for wisdom to lead the empire. David had created peace by securing the boundaries, and all of a sudden they had this incredible reign as the most influential point they would ever have. And now, within one generation, the plans or the trajectory of God's kingdom is dramatically changed. And it largely has to do with a couple of young guys that make some bad decisions and take some bad advice. And today we're going to talk about those two guys. I will warn you up front, today's message, a little bit hard on young people. I'm sorry. I rarely do that. I am a young person. I know I am, okay? I'm not denying that. It's going to be a little bit harder on that group because it fits into the story this way. But I don't usually do that, so I don't think I'm always hard, but I think we need to talk about this. So there are two guys. I told you two guys, young or at least coming newly into positions of power after Solomon's death, who end up really changing the trajectory of things. And their names are Rehoboam and Jeroboam. I don't want you to get them confused, so we're going to hit them one at a time, okay? We'll start with Rehoboam. Now, Rehoboam happens to be the son of Solomon. In fact, the son that is supposed to take over for him upon his death. So Rehoboam, by all intents and purposes, has it made. Remember, Solomon succeeded tremendously. He had all these building projects. He did all these amazing things. He didn't have to fight a lot of wars. And Rehoboam should be set for life. I mean, he should waltz in and have it easy. But unfortunately, things don't go exactly like that. So when Solomon dies, there's this meeting in a city called Shechem, and they meet to sort of, it should just be ceremonial, right? It should just be, okay, we're going to make Rehoboam the new king. He'll waltz in. It'll be ceremonial. We'll all swear allegiance, and then we'll go home and we'll have a new king. Everything should follow the book and be easy peasy, except it doesn't. Because in this meeting, the people come back to Rehoboam with a request. If you're following along, we are now in 1 Kings chapter 12. We've been surveying the whole Bible in the series we're calling The Story, and we are up to 1 Kings chapter 12. So there's this section where the people come to him and they ask a very specific question. The people, speaking to Rehoboam, pre-finalizing his kingship, say, "Your father," and who is that? Solomon. "Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." Rehoboam answered, "Go away for 3 days and then come back to me." And so the people went away. Now here's what's going on. Solomon was indeed a very successful king, and he had a lot of building projects. In fact, one of his building projects was the building of the temple itself, Solomon's temple, and that required a lot of intense labor. And all these things that he did also required a lot of taxes. So between the labor and the taxes, you can imagine, even though he was wildly successful, it was a burdensome time for some groups of people in Israel. However, that's part of what happens when you're successful and you've got all these projects to do and things of that nature. So it's a natural and honestly quite reasonable request. Please be easier on us than your father. If you do that, we will honor you and serve you as the king. And so they give this advice to Rehoboam, a relatively young man coming into his own who hears this, and he tells them, go away for 3 days, let me think about it, and I'll come back and answer your question. And this is where it gets really interesting, So Rehoboam hears this rather reasonable request, and he takes two pieces of advice. One from the elders of the city and those who had served his father, and one from his friends. You can imagine that they came up with two totally different responses. And I want you to hear their responses and tell me which you think is the better advice. All right? Young man coming into his own looking for good advice. First, he talks to the elders. We are down to verse 6 here. Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime, people who are experienced in the matter, people who know how things go. He asked them this important question about how to respond. How would you advise me to answer these people, he asked. And they replied, if today you will be a what? A servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, that means say yes, they will always be your what? Servants. You serve them and they will serve you. You say yes, they will follow you all their life and you will have it made. Just go up there, agree to them. He almost anticipates what Jesus talks about later on as servant leadership, right? When Jesus gets down on his hands and knees and he washes his disciples' feet and he talks about leaders don't lord it over their people but rather serve them. He's almost anticipating that. And they say, okay, if you will be a servant, then they will serve you. Those are the elders, their advice. Now, we have this young guy, and he hears what the older folks say, and he said, okay, that's fine and all. But then in the very next verse, and actually I don't think I have this on the screen, but it says, but he rejected their advice and instead went to his friends. Does that sound familiar? Any of you ever looked to the advice of fellow peers instead of the advice of people maybe a little more seasoned than you? Let's just say it happens. So here's what he does. He goes to his friends. And verse 10, the young men who had grown up with him replied, these people have said to you, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter. Now tell them this. This is the young guy's advice. My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. That's to say, I'm bigger than him. I'm stronger than him. I'm more powerful. It's a comparison thing, right? Going on to verse 11. My father laid on you a heavy yoke, and I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. Now, is that a very nice response? What is that? That's a tough guy act. That's a, no, I'm the king here, and you're going to do what I say. This is a guy who wants to come in and make himself known. And so he comes in with this speech about how my finger is bigger than my father's waist. He's scourged you with whips, and I'll scourge you with scorpions. You listen and obey. I'm the king, and I'm the man around here. Now, does that sound like something a young person would ever do? Not take the good advice, but take the bad advice? Let me tell you something, something that I think I've kind of learned along the way, and that is that when you are a leader in any kind of situation, do you know how important it is to be able to distinguish good advice from bad advice? Like, it's absolutely key. Because I don't know if you know this, but you will get a lot of advice in your lifetime. And some of them will be from people who know what they're doing, and some of them will be from people who think they know what they're doing. And if you don't have the ability to distinguish between those two things, you're going to get lost pretty quick. Fair enough? Meanwhile, remember, Solomon, his father, was known as the wisest man who ever lived. And Rehoboam comes in here and fails to distinguish good advice from bad advice, likely because he'd already decided in his mind what he wanted to do. Have you ever done that? You say you're going for advice, but you know in your heart and in your mind you've already decided. I don't know why Jen comes to me for advice all the time on buying things. She asks me what she thinks we should get, and I tell her, and then she does the exact opposite every time. I'm giving you a hard time, but there's some truth to that, is there not? And I know that's a small thing. That's not really what we're talking about. But we have this tendency to ask for advice, even from people we trust and admire, but in our heart of hearts, we already kind of know what we want to do. So why? Why does he take this bad advice? Why does he go and get all haughty and tell them what to do and all this or that? Well, honestly, I think part of it is he's young, coming into this new role, and he wants to make a name for himself. He wants to appear aggressive. Sometimes when young people come up, they come in and they have all these ideas, and sometimes they're a little overly aggressive, wanting to make a name for themselves, and they push themselves too far out there, and sometimes things don't work out. I don't know how many young preachers have dropped out of the ministry after their very first ministry because they came out of Bible college thinking they were going to change the world and rushed some church into all sorts of changes that they weren't ready for and didn't desire. It happens all the time. There are managers who come into restaurants and they have all these ideas and all these numbers, and they're doing things and they're throwing around and getting rid of people who have been there for years, who know what they're doing, and they've never even stepped foot in the place. And they do that, but they're trying to make a name for themselves, and what ends up happening? The place falls apart. Unfortunately, sometimes we come in trying to be aggressive, make a name for ourselves, especially when we're young, and we forego the wisdom of people who have been there before us. Another reason why I think he does this, I think he assumes, he's presumptuous, he feels entitled. He assumes that he should have everything his father had immediately. My father had the trust of all of the empire. They loved him. They worshiped. But adored him, and he was so successful and had all this success. The moment I step into that, I'm going to have everything he had. And he forgets that sometimes earning that trust and becoming beloved takes time. Yes, you have the authority, but it doesn't mean you have the loyalty yet. And sometimes being presumptuous and entitled and thinking you have all of that does not earn you any favors whatsoever. Sometimes I think young people come out of school and say, hey, look at this degree that I've got. This says I'm in charge, and now I come in and I expect you all to see and trust and know and obey and do everything that I want to do all this time, because now is my time to take the world by storm. Is that a little entitled, a little presumptuous, and maybe an attitude that disrupts things in the workplace? Sorry, I know I'm being a little hard on the young people. It's something we've all done. I too, trust me, came in with a complex believing I was going to change the entire world. It's something that's natural and normal, but we have to be careful. Another reason why I think he rejected the good advice was his own pride. Rehoboam wanted everyone to follow him regardless of what he did or said. And it hurt his pride that they came back and asked him for a concession first. Does pride ever get in the way of taking good advice? Because too often, good advice comes with humility. And it can hurt your pride to take it. So, for a lot of reasons, things for Rehoboam don't go quite like you imagine. And as we read in that opening video, things don't go well for Israel either. It creates a rift, and problems begin to happen. In order to get into that, let me go ahead and introduce our other young guy by the name of Jeroboam. Now, Jeroboam is a little bit different. He's not a king by any sense. He is, in fact, just a person of the town, but someone with a lot of talent and someone who people admire. And so Solomon actually uses him. Solomon sees his talent. This is, Rehoboam's dad, sees Jeroboam's talent and puts him in charge of the labor force of all the tribes of Joseph. Do you know what that means? He was over a bunch of people. And he was talented and influential. And eventually it came to a point where he and Solomon didn't get along. And now Jeroboam is still along. And Rehoboam's rejection of the people's request creates an opportunity for Jeroboam. And we can see where this is going. But first, let's back up a little bit in time and talk about the day Jeroboam was going about his business and met a prophet. That prophet's name is Ahijah. And this is out of 1 Kings chapter 11. So Jeroboam is going about his business, and he runs into a prophet who starts doing something very strange. Ahijah is wearing this new coat or tunic or cloak or something like that. He takes it off, and he starts tearing it into pieces, which is a bizarre thing to do, right? And he tears it into, in fact, 12 pieces. And if you know anything about number symbols in the Bible, 12 almost always represents what? The 12 tribes of Israel. And so he tears his robe into 12 tribes, or into the 12 pieces, which are the 12 tribes, and he hands 10 of them to Jeroboam. This is a symbolic prophecy. We see more of this in the early prophets. So here's what he says, verse 31. Then Ahijah said to Jeroboam, take 10 pieces of that cloak for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand, not really Solomon, but Solomon's son, Rehoboam, and give you 10 tribes. There's only 12. He's saying, Jeroboam, you are going to be this king, and I'm going to give you these things. Jump down to verse 34. But I will not take the whole kingdom out of Solomon's hand. I have made him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of David, my servant, whom I chose, and who obeyed my commands and decrees. In other words, I'm not going to take all of it and give it to you, Jeroboam. I'm going to take just some of it because I made a promise to David, and I care about David, and so you're not getting all of it. And then go down to 36. I will give one tribe to his son, so that David, my servant, may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I choose to put my name. That tribe, the main one we're thinking of, is Judah. Judah is the tribe from which David came, and it's the line from which the kings come. Now, the other tribe, I know it said 10 and 1, the other tribe is Benjamin, and for whatever reason, it gets thrown in the Judah part. So 10 tribes go to Jeroboam, who will be the king over them, and 2 tribes stay with Rehoboam, the king. Now all of a sudden, we went from having Israel as one nation at the height of their power and influence under Solomon. We had some guys take some bad advice, and now it's split in two. It's split into a north and a south, and I've got a map to try to help you with this. I know it's going to be a little hard to read, like it's a little small. I did my best to highlight the things you really needed to know. But here's what matters. Do you see the green? The green is in the north, right? At this point, now that they have split, that is what we call Israel, because it's got 10 tribes in it. Sometimes referred to as Ephraim, sometimes referred to as Samaria. Whatever it is, the northern part is now known as Israel, and they will have a new king by the name of Jeroboam, the talented guy. In the south, that becomes known simply as Judah, named after its biggest tribe. And now, from here on, for the rest of the Old Testament, essentially, Israel is 2 nations, Israel and Judah. And never again will they entirely be together. Notice in the orange, there's a really important city where they built the temple. What is the name of that city? Jerusalem belongs to the south. Keep that in mind. Because I told you that both of these guys make some bad decisions and take some bad advice. But I really haven't given you any bad decision that Jeroboam made necessarily. He was actually told by the prophet that he would be the king, and he accepted and understood that. And so when the people meet and have that meeting about who's going to be the next king, they ask him for that, it was at Jeroboam's idea to ask him that. He was there at the meeting. You see what's happening? So he's starting to influence these things, and things are getting tense. And then Jeroboam makes his really, really big mistake. I want you to jump down. We are now in 1 Kings 12 and verse 26. Pay attention to this. This is really, really important. I know it sounds a bit like history, but this is really key, so tune in here. Jeroboam thought to himself, the kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David. That is, they'll probably get back together and return to Rehoboam. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, and in which half is Jerusalem? The south. Jerusalem's in the south. He's in the north. If they go all the way to Jerusalem to worship and go to the temple, they will again give their allegiance to their lord Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam. He's worried about protecting what God has given him, which is the 10 tribes. And it's kind of a geographical problem, right? And so he decides he needs to do something about it. We can't let them go from the north and travel to the south to worship. They need their own temples. Going down to verse 28. And then what did he do? Sought advice. Okay. Sounds familiar, right? He's very practical. He's thinking about this in a very practical way. The king made 2 golden, what? Calves. Anyone know anything about golden calves in the Bible? It never turns out well. The Israelites, when Moses was up on the mountain receiving the 10 commandments, and he was up there 40 days and 40 nights, and they were all worried about him, and he comes back down the mountain, he finds them that they have created their own gods and are now worshiping what? Golden calves. Ouch. So Jeroboam thinks the solution to the people traveling to the temple in the south and somehow being persuaded to leave him, he thinks the solution is to build golden calves, that is to lead them into idolatry. He said to the people, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." The one God of the universe brought them up out of Egypt and told them not to worship any idols or have any gods other than him. How do you think the God of the universe feels about, "Here are your gods," and it's a little golden statue? Not great. In fact, this is such a key sin that this is very, very problematic. And so he tells them, these are your gods, and here's where you're going to worship. One he set up in Bethel, and the other in Dan. Now I want to go back to that map, and I want to show you how practical his solution is. Go back to the map. Remember, the north, the green is what? Israel. And the south in orange is what? Judah, and Jerusalem is there in the south, so they would have to cross into the orange to worship in Jerusalem, except that Jeroboam decides, nah, you don't need to do that. And so he sets up 2 false temples. I've got another slide here. Look where they go. One is at Dan and one is at Bethel. Now notice their locations. How practical and smart and clever is this? The false temples, one is built in the far north, right? So if you're an Israelite living anywhere in the northern half, you go there to worship. And one of them is in the far what? South. So if you're in the southern part, you can go there. And notice the difference in mileage from Bethel to Jerusalem. I should have looked this up. I don't know, but it's got to be small. Like that's got to be no more than a day's walk. But while you're on your way to Jerusalem, just stop here. You can do your sacrifices in Bethel. Same thing, right? Except that it's not. Because these are false temples. And Jeroboam, who had God's blessing to get these 10 tribes, has now abandoned that by trying to fix this perceived problem on his own, trying to hold on to the thing that he's afraid he's going to lose. Because when God gives you something, apparently you can lose it. And he tries to make this deal and comes up with what is really leading them into idolatry. And it's so problematic and it's so wrong. Why does he do it? He does it because he has no principles. He has no morals. He doesn't rest on the idea that there's one and only one God and that his name is the name and he is the only one. No, he has no principle. He's only being practical. Number two, I think he does it because he's too smart for his own good. Have you ever known anyone like that? Who's really clever and really smart, but they do it to their own problems. They create their own problems because they're too smart for their own good. And they don't have the principles and the morals to back it up. Sometimes I think young people try and reinvent the wheel. Do you know what I mean by that? Sometimes they try to come back and change everything to some new idea that they heard somewhere, instead of looking and examining and distinguishing between what works and what doesn't work. Sometimes we fail to recognize the wisdom of those who have done things before us and actually had a few good ideas in those last several thousand years that they've been doing it. And maybe we don't have to reinvent the wheel in every generation. Maybe there are things to take from our past. I think that's something that we miss sometimes. And the third reason I think he does it is, honestly, I think that Jeroboam is unappreciative of how he got to where he is. Why is Jeroboam the king over these 10 tribes? Was it something that he did, or did God give it to him? God gave it to him. And if God gave it to him, then turning your back and leading Israel to worship other gods is just detestable. It's the worst kind of ingratitude imaginable. Sometimes I think kids who grew up very blessed and their parents teaching them things then go on and reject their parents later on in a variety of ways. And it's painful and it hurts because they fail to realize how much of where they are, they got from them. There's a lack of perspective that comes with youth, and it leaves us sometimes a little unappreciative. Does that make sense? So Rehoboam and Jeroboam have each taken advice and made terrible decisions. We went from the wisest man who ever lived to now a nation split in two. One committed to worshiping the golden calves in 2 false temples, one still worshiping the true God in Jerusalem. But neither of them is going to do great. And this next season of Kings is going to be problematic in so many ways. I told you that last week was the high point, and I meant it. Because now, as we move in this trajectory to do 2 different kingdoms, Israel will not end up with any good kings. Judah will end up with a handful. And the rest of the story is not necessarily one to celebrate. In fact, the Bible's feelings on Jeroboam's sin in particular are incredibly strong. I was reading through it and I found a summary statement of his kingship in chapter 13 and verse 34. And I want you to read this because this is powerful. This is how the author summarizes Jeroboam, how strongly they feel about this. This, the worshiping of the false temples, was, and what's it say? Not a sin. What is it? The sin. This was the sin of the house of Jeroboam that led to its downfall and to its destruction from the face of the earth. That is a strong summary statement, is it not? That was not that was a sin, that was the sin that led to their downfall and their destruction from the face of the earth. In fact, we're given a little bit more detail into some of that because later he's approached by a prophet who, by the way, is the same prophet of before. What was his name? Anyone remember? I tricked you. You guys should have been taking notes. Ahijah, who told him that he would have these 10 empires, comes back into the picture and confronts him for his sin. And this is what Ahijah says to him, going down to 14 and verse 7. Go tell Jeroboam, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I raised you up from among the people and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. You remember that, right? Who was the guy that gave you this? Me. I tore the kingdom away from the house of David and gave it to you. And you know how much I like David. I actually tore it away from his family to give you this. God's recounting what he's done for him. But you have not been like my servant David, who followed me with all his heart, doing only what was right in my eyes. And then verse 9, it really says it all. He says to Jeroboam, you have done more evil than all who lived before you. Wow. That is harsh. You have done more evil than anyone who lived before you by leading them to worship these false gods. You have really messed up. You have made for yourself other gods, idols made of metal. You have aroused my anger and turned your back on me. See, the sad part is that the North never really recovers. They never really come back into the picture. They end up intermingling with other peoples and continuing worshiping in these false places. And in fact, this is part of the discussion going on in John chapter 4 when Jesus is speaking to the Samaritan woman at the well. They're talking about, where should we worship? This continues on. In fact, this is the history and background of what we call the Samaritans. And if you know anything about the New Testament, how did Jews feel about Samaritans? They despised them. They were half-breeds. They had false religion. They were sort of brothers, but ones who had betrayed the family. When Jesus talks about the Good Samaritan, it's because he's picking apart exactly the kind of person they don't like. This is setting the stage for what is really never going to fully recover. The trajectory of everything God built changes when these two guys make bad decisions on bad advice. You see, I think there is something about each generation that we have to go through making similar mistakes. We have to reject those that came before us and carve out our own little place in it all. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we make mistakes. I think sometimes each generation throws the baby out with the bathwater, failing to keep the good ideas of those who have gone before them, and instead of building on those, try to reinvent the wheel and make a name for themselves. Sometimes we fail to realize that the way we used to do things actually is the way we could continue to do things, that we don't have to try to do it all. Sometimes we throw out things that had a bad part of them instead of fixing them and making them more correct. And trust me, I also came up and living in a reaction to the generation before me, trying to change things in ways that I thought that it needed to happen. And I understand and I get that tendency, but I also realize that sometimes we only go back one generation when we really ought to go back 10. Because whereas we might react against our parents, we also might find that our grandparents and great-grandparents had a few good ideas. And part of continuing the good of the past is going back a little further than our minds tend to comprehend. I think that we, as each generation, is too presumptuous, thinking we will get everything that our parents had. Sometimes we come out of college thinking we are owed that top-level job and that big house and for everything to go easy for us. And the truth is, we remember how it was for our parents when we were in high school, but we forgot how it was for our parents when they were just starting out. They had to work their way to what they got. And we will too. I think sometimes every generation is too reactionary, and they try to do anything to not be like those before them, which is often a mistake and leads us down roads we don't need to go. You see, there are so many categories in life that I could use to apply this, and I don't have the time to go into great depth, but let me throw out a couple of things. Traditional ways of worshiping God. You know that for generations we've been worshiping God the same way, and every minister comes out of college and wants to find a new way to worship God. Truth be told, it doesn't matter. However you praise God is how you praise God. You know what? I actually enjoy some of the hymns. Do you? Nothing wrong with that. Now, is it also okay that we worship in new ways? Absolutely. But there was some wisdom in the past. And I don't know how many people I talk to, especially in my Bible studies, that happen to have some of the more mature folks, we shall say, who go about their life and they constantly, those old hymns come to mind and reminds and comforts them as they go about their life. I don't remember the last time a Christian song came into my head. I think that the way households work, every generation wants to change the rules. And I agree that some things needed to be updated. But you know what? Those gender roles of man and woman and husband and wife, they actually worked okay for a long, long time. You know? And I'm not saying there weren't some things that need to be addressed and rethought. They definitely did. But there was no need to throw out those categories altogether, right? Sometimes the way things worked in the past work out okay. I think that the way we deal with sexuality, we try and reinvent the wheel. And the truth be told, statistics are starting to catch up and say that some of the best sexual relationships in society come from people who waited until they got married, because they actually saved themselves and found it more fulfilling in that moment. Sexual identity and waiting are also things that we have thrown off as being in the past and failed to realize. I've had several conversations, and this is real, about people who said that the best sexual activity they ever had came in their 40s and 50s because by that point they knew each other. They lost their inhibitions. They had a comfort. And that sounds so unintuitive, but I've heard it over and over again. I think that we have thrown off with every generation more and more a belief in something bigger than ourselves, and instead opted for pessimism and meaninglessness. I think that we have abandoned belief in God and the church because we see so many problems in them that we think that it cannot be redeemed, and yet God sent His Son to redeem them. And we say that at the same time. But the church is meaningful and a part of life and has been for generation after generation. I think we throw off our belief in good institutions, that they all have to be entirely broken, from the government to the education to the media. And we throw off the idea of hope itself. We throw off a belief that marriage is anything more than a piece of paper, and instead make it some meaningless ritual when in fact it is an essential part of life, something God ordained from the garden. Every generation makes the same mistakes in slightly different ways. We either reject the advice of those before us, or we're so practical in trying to reinvent the wheel that we abandon all principles and morals to try to hold on to something we think is ours. We're either Rehoboam or we're Jeroboam. And no matter which way we go, we're making the errors of youth. God's story is dramatically changed when a generation comes up and takes them from their best of times to something new. And I warn you, I warn myself, to be careful whose advice we take, because it can make all the difference. If you will, let's bow our heads. God, we love you and thank you and praise you and ask that you'll be with us today. May we be responsible. May we make good decisions. May we be faithful to our principles and morals. And may we find our way to sort of carve out our own place in this world. But I pray, Lord, that it's the place you put us and not a place we imagined. We thank you and love you and all that you do. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.